Every society, doesn't matter if it's ancient or right now, they come up with rules, right? To keep things running smoothly, define what's ethical, especially in places people really respect, like religious institutions. And these rules aren't just dry bits of text. They often tell a story born from real events, showing us how communities actually worked. So today, we're doing a deep dive into exactly that kind of rule.
Yeah.
We're heading back to ancient Buddhist monastic texts, the Vinaya Pitaka specifically. And this isn't just some dusty old regulation. It's like a window, a direct look into that really delicate relationship between monks and the lay people who supported them. And what happens when those lines get, well, a bit blurred. Our mission today: unpack the story behind this rule, dig into the details, some are pretty surprising, and see what it tells us about trust, generosity, community way back then. We're basing all this purely on one source, an excerpt called Nissaggiya 27. Ready to jump in?
Absolutely. It's a fascinating case study.
Okay, so let's set the scene. We're in Savatthi, an ancient city, at the Jetavana Monastery, a really famous place. There's this lay patron, a supporter, who's getting ready for a trip. Before he goes, he tells his wife, look, take this thread to this particular weaver. He names the weaver, get a robe made. Put it aside. When I get back, we'll give it to Venerable Upananda. A nice, thoughtful gift planned out.
A very standard act of generosity in that context.
But here's the twist. Just by chance, an alms-collecting monk happens to overhear this whole conversation, this private plan. How often does that happen in these texts? An overheard comment kicking things off seems almost staged.
It happens quite a bit, actually. These texts are trying to capture how rules emerged from, well, real life. Messy situations. An overheard word, a misunderstanding, someone seeing something they thought wasn't right. These are often the sparks. They ground the ethics in actual human behavior.
And here, the connection's even tighter, because it turns out the weaver the patron mentioned, he's also a supporter of the same monk, Upananda.
Right, so there's a pre-existing relationship there between the weaver and the intended recipient.
Exactly. The stage is set, all the players know each other, sort of, and Upananda now has this opening.
An opportunity, as he perhaps saw.
So Upananda gets wind of this, maybe from that alms-collecting monk, maybe another way. The text isn't explicit on how he heard, just that he knew, and he decides to act. He goes directly to the weaver's place, and the text stresses this: uninvited.
That's a crucial detail. Uninvited.
He doesn't wait. He just shows up while the robe is presumably being planned or started. And he starts making very specific requests about his robe. He says, and this is a direct quote, "This robe is being woven for me. Make it long, broad, fine, well-spun, well-woven, well-combed, well-carded." Now, some of that sounds okay, right? Like quality control. But long, broad, fine, that sounds different. What's going on there?
You've hit the nail on the head. It's a mixed bag, well-spun, well-woven, well-combed, well-carded. That's about craftsmanship. Generally, not a problem. A donor would likely want a well-made robe. But long, broad, fine, that's about quantity and quality of the material itself. It implies needing more thread, maybe finer thread, than the patron originally provided or intended.
Okay.
And the weaver gets this immediately. He replies, basically, look, I was given thread for this robe. I can't make it longer, broader, or finer with this thread. But sure, I can make it well-spun, well-woven, etc.
So the weaver points out the limitation. But Upananda, he doesn't let it go.
No, he doesn't.
He insists. He says, go ahead, make it long, broad, and fine. It won't be limited by that thread. What does that even mean? Is he implying the weaver should just get more thread? Or that the patron wouldn't mind?
It's a bit ambiguous, but the implication is strong. He's essentially overriding the weaver's concern, and by extension, the donor's original provision. It suggests either a real lack of consideration for the donor's intent, or maybe a sense of entitlement.
Like, I'm the venerable monk, you should make it happen.
Perhaps something along those lines. Or maybe just not thinking it through. But the effect is the same: pressure. And it's important to remember, this kind of behavior wasn't necessarily the norm, which is why it triggered a response, eventually leading to a rule. The whole point was to encourage contentment, not this.
Right. So the poor weaver is now stuck in the middle.
Completely.
And feeling compelled by Upananda's insistence, what does he do? He goes back to the patron's wife and asks for more thread.
Imagine that conversation. Awkward is probably an understatement.
Definitely. And the wife, understandably, is confused at first. She's like, more thread, but I gave you the thread already.
Makes sense. She fulfilled her husband's instructions.
But then the weaver explains, well, Venerable Upananda insists. And hearing that, she gives in. She actually provides the same amount of thread again, doubling the material cost, essentially.
which shows the influence, or perhaps the social pressure, a monk could exert, even indirectly.
So time passes. The patron comes back from his journey. Upananda, probably thinking everything is fine, visits the patron's home, likely expecting his new robe.
As was customary, yes.
And the robe is presented. Given to Upananda. Done deal on the surface. But then, after the robe is handed over, the wife tells her husband the whole story about Upananda showing up, the demands, the extra thread,
Nissaggiya comes out.
and the patron. He's not happy. The text says he complains bitterly, calls the Sikkhāpada ascetics, that's the Buddha's followers, greedy, discontent, hard to please.
Strong words.
Yeah. And he asks rhetorically, how dare Ayya Upananda, uninvited, approach my weaver and interfere with the robe? The anger is really clear.
And this reaction is key. As you said earlier, it's about trust.
Why is this specific action so corrosive, interfering with the weaver?
Because the whole system relies on dana, on pure generosity. It's based on mutual respect. The lay community supports the monks freely out of devotion. When a monk steps in like Upananda did, especially uninvited and making demands for more, it taints the offering. It shifts from being a gift freely given to something that feels, well, extracted, coerced almost.
Makes the monk look greedy.
Exactly. It undermines the very ideal of the monk as someone detached from material desires. And that perception damages the reputation of the entire Sangha, the monastic community, making lay people hesitant to support them. It's a serious breach of that delicate relationship.
So this patron is complaining loudly. How does this get back to the top, to the Buddha?
Well, the text mentions monks a few desires. These were likely monks particularly committed to the Vinaya, the code of conduct, and sensitive to anything that might harm the Sangha's reputation.
Right.
They overhear the patron's complaints, maybe in the town, maybe near the monastery, and they recognize this is a problem. So they report the matter directly to the Buddha.
And the Buddha calls Upananda in.
Yes. Standard procedure. He summons Upananda and asks him directly about the incident.
And Upananda, does he deny it?
No, he confirms it. He admits to what happened.
Then the Buddha asks this really interesting question, not why did you do it, but...
He asks, Upananda, are you related to this lay patron or are you unrelated?
And Upananda says, unrelated. Why is that the critical question? Why does relatedness matter so much here?
This is central to the ruling. Being unrelated is hugely significant. The Buddha points out that an unrelated person, especially a monk in this position, simply cannot know the donor's mind. You don't know their actual capacity to give, their original intention, whether asking for more is suitable or unsuitable, or even if the initial gift was stretching their resources, real or unreal, as the text puts it.
So if you're related, there's maybe an assumed understanding or a different dynamic?
Exactly. Within a family, there might be more open communication, a better sense of what's appropriate or possible. But an unrelated monk making demands, that crosses a clear boundary. It looks like taking advantage of the donor's generosity precisely because there isn't that close relationship or understanding.
It's presumption, basically.
Yes, a serious presumption. It's interfering where you haven't been invited and where you lack the standing or knowledge to do so appropriately. It fundamentally changes the nature of the gift.
So the Buddha's response is pretty sharp.
Very. He says, you fool, which is strong language coming from the Buddha. An unrelated person doesn't know what is suitable or unsuitable, real or unreal. How dare you, uninvited, approach an unrelated lay patron's weaver and interfere with the robe?
Wow. Okay, and from this specific incident, this mistake by Upananda,
comes a formal training rule, a Sikkhāpada for all monks.
to prevent this from happening again,
Precisely. This becomes the precedent case for a particular type of offense.
which is called
It's classified as a Nissaggiya pācittiya offense.
Nissaggiya pācittiya. Okay, let's break that down. What's the core rule that comes out of this?
The rule essentially says, if a lay patron man or woman who is unrelated to the monk arranges for a robe to be woven for that monk, and that monk, being uninvited, goes to the weaver and interferes, asks for it to be made longer, broader, finer, even just generally better, and possibly gives or implies even a tiny return.
Like giving the weaver some of his alms food.
Exactly. Even something that small, suggesting a kind of exchange or payment. If the monk does that, it constitutes this Nissaggiya pācittiya offense.
Okay, let's unpack those terms more. Unrelated. How unrelated do you have to be?
The text is incredibly specific. It means not related by blood on either the mother's or father's side, going back 7 generations on the father's side.
Wow, that's detailed. And uninvited.
Means the patron didn't explicitly ask the monk beforehand, "Sir, what kind of robe would you like?" Or, "Is there anything specific you need?" The monk initiated the specifications without being asked.
And interferes. That covers Upananda's specific words, but also more.
Yes, it covers asking for those specific qualities, long, broad, fine, well-made. And crucially, it includes even hinting at giving something back.
You mentioned alms food. What does that cover? Is it just food?
No, the definition is surprisingly broad. It includes basics like gruel or cooked rice, but also things like powder, a toothpick, string for cleaning teeth.
A toothpick. Serious.
Seriously. Or even teaching the Dhamma, the Buddha's teachings, in that context. It shows how strictly they wanted to avoid any sense of a transaction, any quid pro quo, however small. The gift must remain pure.
Okay, and Nissaggiya pācittiya, what does that mean for the monk? What are the consequences?
It's a serious offense category in the Vinaya. It requires two things. First, Nissaggiya, which means forfeiture. The item obtained improperly, in this case, the robe, must be given up.
He doesn't get to keep the fancy robe.
Absolutely not. And second, pācittiya, which requires confession. The monk must formally confess the offense to another monk or the community. It's a disciplinary measure involving both material loss and public acknowledgement of the transgression.
And how does the timing work? When does the offense actually occur?
There's a distinction. If the weaver actually starts making the robe longer, broader, or finer based on the monk's improper request, the monk commits a lesser offense, called a dukkaya, at that point during the weaving.
A dukkaya? Like a minor infraction?
Yes, a wrongdoing, but less severe than the full offense. However, the moment the monk receives the completed, improperly influenced robe, that's when it becomes the full Nissaggiya pācittiya, requiring forfeiture and confession.
So receiving the end product seals the main offense.
Correct. And that forfeited robe, it has to be formally given over to the Sangha, the community, or sometimes to a designated group or individual within the Sangha, following specific procedures. It can't just be, thrown away. It's a formal return of the ill-gotten gain.
These rules are so layered. What about the monk's intention or understanding? Does it matter if he thought he was related?
That's another fascinating layer. The rule is quite strict on this. If the monk knows the patron is unrelated and interferes, it's Nissaggiya pācittiya. If he's doubtful about being related but interferes anyway, still Nissaggiya pācittiya.
Okay, that makes sense. But what if he genuinely makes a mistake?
Here's where it gets really strict. Even if the monk mistakenly believes they are related, but objectively, factually, they are unrelated and he interferes, still Nissaggiya pācittiya.
Wow. So objective fact trumps subjective belief entirely.
In this case, yes. The potential harm to the donor relationship and the Sangha's reputation is considered paramount, regardless of the monk's mistaken understanding of the family ties.
Are there lesser offenses then? You mentioned dukkaya.
Yes. The dukkaya applies in the reverse scenario. If the monk is actually related to the patron, but he mistakenly thinks they are unrelated or he's doubtful about it and then interferes, that's considered a dukkaya, the lesser offense, because objectively, the condition of being unrelated wasn't met.
So the core offense hinges on actually being unrelated.
Precisely.
But it's not like monks could never talk about robes, right? There must be exceptions.
Oh, absolutely. The rules always include no offense scenarios to clarify the boundaries.
What are some of those?
Well, obviously, if the monk is actually related, according to that 7-generation definition, no offense for interfering.
Okay.
If the monk was invited by the patron, what kind of robe do you need, sir? Then specifying is fine. No offense. If the monk is interfering, but it's for someone else's benefit, not his own robe, no offense.
So it's about personal gain.
Yes. Also, if the monk uses his own resources, his own money perhaps, to get the weaver to make improvements, that's fine too.
Makes sense.
There's an interesting one. If a patron intends to have an expensive robe woven, but for some reason a cheap one gets made instead. No offense for the monk receiving it, the deviation wasn't driven by the monk asking for more.
Right, it wasn't the monk's doing to inflate the value.
Exactly. And then there are standard exemptions. If the monk is considered insane, not mentally responsible. And the first offender clause, Upananda himself, the one who caused the rule to be made, isn't retroactively punished by this specific formulation.
So these exemptions really clarify things. It's not about stopping communication. It's about stopping.
Exploitation, coercion, undue influence. It's about preserving the purity of the gift and the monk's role as a contented recipient, not a demanding customer. It protects the whole system of trust and generosity.
So we've traced this thread, so to speak, from one monk's lapse in judgment, one interaction with a weaver and a patron, all the way to a very specific, detailed rule in the Vinaya Pitaka. It really shows you how these ethical codes were built, piece by piece, responding to real life.
It does. And this deep dive, it isn't just about an old rule. It reveals this ongoing, deep concern for trust, for clear boundaries, protecting that spirit of generosity, protecting the reputation of the Sangha from appearing, as the patron said, greedy or manipulative. It's about safeguarding the integrity of giving and receiving in a spiritual context.
Which brings us to a final thought for you listening. As you reflect on this, think about our own lives, our modern interactions. How do we make sure our own requests, our influence, even when we mean well, don't accidentally put pressure on others? Don't compromise the genuine spirit of a relationship or a gift. What unexpected boundaries might you need to be more mindful of in your own life when you give and when you receive? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the intricate world of ancient monastic rules and the timeless lessons they still hold.